Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is History of Magic. Today, I'm going to be looking at the phasing mechanic. Released all the way back in Magic's second block, this mechanic faded into obscurity before coming back into Magic's consciousness in a big way. Today, I'll go through the history of phasing from its earliest days to the current time. Ready? Let's get started. Phasing debuted in Mirage at the end of 1996 as a block mechanic. In the past, Magic sets used to be organized into blocks. Mirage block was designed as 3 sets, which became the standard from that point up until when blocks were redesigned in 2014. Mirage block set the standard composition for 3 set blocks, which consisted of 1 larger set and 2 smaller sets following it, all of which shared the same setting as well as some mechanical and thematic connections. A block mechanic was some mechanic that was used throughout a block. Although this was still in the early days of the model, block mechanics were not generally expected to be reused in future sets since they were thematically tied to the setting that they were introduced in. One of the block mechanics used in Mirage was flanking, which was seen on many of the knights in that plane. The other was phasing, which represented how the block setting had a damaged time stream, and therefore some of its denizens flickered in and out of existence. Permanents on the battlefield are normally phased in, but there's another plane of existence which is phased out. While phased out, a permanent can't affect or be affected by anything in the phased in plane. Creatures with phasing phase in and out, alternating between those two states on each of their controllers' turns before untapping. When a permanent phases out, all counters stay on it, and anything that was attached to it phases out also. When it phases back in, those things phase back in along with it. Now, that's the high-level overview. I didn't talk about specifics because there is a couple of ways that phasing has changed over time. I'll review those as we go along. In its debut, phasing didn't make much of a splash. It had a couple of main mechanical uses. Some permanents, mostly creatures, had the phasing ability, which R&D used as a drawback to offset these creatures better than normal stats compared to their mana cost. Likewise, some cards phased out other permanents or gave them the phasing ability, generally as a drawback. There were some other cards that could phase themselves or other cards out at instant speed, generally seen as a form of protection against more permanent removal. Unfortunately, phasing ended up being rather unpopular. Phasing creatures were relatively underpowered since the drawback of not being in play half the time proved to be much steeper than the cost reduction that it was meant to offset, and the hardening of your board against mass removal effects proved inconsequential compared to the reduction in the amount of available force to break through stalemates. Phasing also had a reputation for introducing several rules headaches, mainly involving whether the phasing event happened at what time and whether it interacted with various enters or leaves the battlefield abilities. The rules at this time in Magic's history were not nearly as robust as what we have today, and many rulings seemed ad hoc or illogical. I'll talk more about this as I go over the various changes that the mechanic has seen. The most significant impact phasing had in its debut run was seen after the release of Visions, which contained the combo of Equipoise plus Sands of Time. Although at this point the untap step consisted strictly of just untapping your permanents, and phasing happened just before it, the ruling was still that skipping the untap step would also skip the time when phased out permanents would normally phase in. Therefore, if you could manage to get rid of all of your lands, for example, via a card like Desolation, you could permanently phase all of your opponent's lands out, locking the game up. The deck naturally didn't play many or any creatures, so those would get phased out too, and once the lock was established, victory would come via a card like Miser's Cage. After its debut, phasing faded into obscurity for almost a decade until Odyssey block. 2 cards from this block synergized very well with phasing cards. Well, okay, technically Chance Encounter didn't synergize with Frenetic Efreet because of phasing specifically, but it was nice that this creature lets you flip a coin at instant speed for free. Now the other one is a little bit less of a cheat. Originally, phasing did not trigger enters the battlefield abilities, but did trigger leaves the battlefield abilities. Now, some other cards thus had fun combos with Cloak of Invisibility and other cards that phased creatures in and out, but Wormfang Mantra was the king. Neither of these interactions was overpowered, and decks built around them never progressed beyond meme status, but at least these raised the mind share of phasing, which started the train on one of the biggest glow-ups since Gen 5 Clefable. A couple of years after Odyssey, somewhere around 2004 or 2005, some of the wizards noticed that phasing target creature out was more or less exactly what Arabian Nights Pauper All-Star Oubliette did. These dates are just speculation for me since I can't recall with certainty when this change was enacted, nor am I aware of a resource that lists historical oracle text to check. But I can't say for sure that the change happened before February 21, 2005, since I found a reference to the new text of Oubliette and Tanos' Coffin on the official Wizards website on that date. I'm inclined to believe that the change happened fairly close to that time, since the rules for phasing had a change shortly afterwards in the CR update from 9th edition to Ravnica 1. At that time, phasing functioned by moving the affected permanents from the battlefield to a special phased-out zone. Despite the fact that it officially involved a zone change, there was never a time in Magic's history when phasing in triggered enters the battlefield abilities. Like I noted before, however, phasing out would cause leaves the battlefield abilities to trigger. Now, if you're wondering why there was a discrepancy, a lot of enters the battlefield abilities printed before Mirage Block were drawbacks that were flavorfully connected to summoning the creature. That or choices that were made as the creature entered the battlefield. Remember that when phasing was first introduced, there wasn't a clean separation between triggered abilities and replacement effects like we have now. Now, it felt bad from a gameplay perspective to have these recur every time a permanent phased in, and it didn't really make sense in the context of what phasing was flavorfully trying to accomplish. So the rules team basically just said that phasing didn't count as entering the battlefield for the purpose of effects like these. By Ravnica 1, these historical reasons had faded sufficiently from people's consciousness for the rules team to start wondering why leaves the battlefield abilities should be treated any differently. By this time, most ETB abilities were beneficial, replacement effects were a thing, and flavorfully, phasing still didn't correspond to entering or leaving the battlefield. So it was decided that it would not count as leaving the battlefield for the purpose of triggering any abilities either. Now, like I said, I think that changing the Oracle text of Oubliette was what really brought this change into the spotlight. The more robust rules framework that made the change possible had existed for some time now, but up until this point, phasing had kind of been out of sight, out of mind. Shortly afterwards, in Dissension, the CR received an update that would set the stage for the next major change to hit phasing. The previous block, Kamigawa 1, had introduced flip cards. No, not double-faced cards, flip cards. Mero actually stated that R&D played around with the idea of double-faced cards at this time, but the powers that be declared the idea untenable. Every Magic card needed to have the same back. It's interesting to think about how Magic might have been different if DFCs had been chosen as the solution to this issue after all. Or even if modal DFCs had been greenlit instead of split cards back in Invasion Block. Anyways, flip cards were a cool idea, but they spawned a lot of rules questions, especially related to copy effects. If you cloned a Stab Whisker the Odious, what side would the clone be? If you used Cytoshape to make a Stab Whisker the Odious into a Jushi Apprentice, would it still be flipped? There were a lot of similar questions involving the morph mechanic that was introduced a few years back too. Unfortunately, there wasn't really a robust framework that gave a good idea to what the answer to questions like this were supposed to be. And then, someone at Wizards came up with the innovation that would crack this problem wide open. The answer was statuses. If you clone a tapped creature, the clone doesn't enter tapped, right? This is pretty well known and well understood by most players. So what if flipped and unflipped, or face up and face down, were treated just like that? The final piece of the puzzle was making it so that the rules would use a permanent status to determine its characteristics. So if this permanent status was unflipped, its name would be Nezumi Shortfang, it would be a 1/1, and so on. If it was flipped, it would take the other set of characteristics. That same sort of reasoning would work for face-down cards being assigned the alternate characteristics defined by the morph mechanic. And thus, the CR codified the notion of status and defined these three binary statuses as something every permanent had, as well as specifying that all permanents entered the battlefield with the default values of untapped, face-up, and unflipped unless specified otherwise. This rules concept has evolved a few times since then, but now we're ready for the next major change that phasing had. In Magic 2010, several areas of the rules were reworked. As part of this, there were also many changes in standard templating. One major non-functional change was the introduction of the term battlefield. Prior to this, the official game term for this zone was, I kid you not, the in-play zone. This is why many older cards say things like comes into play or put it into play. Now, while this was a non-functional change, it got Wizards thinking, what about some of these other zones? When something phases out, it goes to the descriptively named phased out zone. Great. Except that doesn't count as changing zones for most game purposes. Well, what if it just didn't count as changing zones, period? And so, one of the changes in M10 was that a fourth status, phased in or phased out, was introduced. The phased out zone was phased out, and phasing was reworked to involve changing the affected permanent's status. Honestly, this is one of the best ideas that the rules team did not get enough credit for. It streamlines things beautifully, perfectly making use of existing rule structures without adding anything new. Now, there's one major last change for the phasing mechanic, and it took place about 7 years later, concurrently with the mechanic's reintroduction in the form of Teferi's Protection in Commander 2017. This card phased out all your permanents, including your tokens. Originally, tokens that phased out would cease to exist. This made sense because in the original definition of phasing, which involved moving to a different game zone, well, yeah, tokens cease to exist anytime they move from the battlefield to a different game zone. When phasing was amended to be a status change in Magic 2010, this state-based action was rewritten so that the ruling would stay the same. Teferi's Protection gave a compelling reason to change this, though, especially since a lot of white decks that would otherwise want to run this card probably play a lot of tokens. Losing all of them would be a big hit. This rules change had major implications for Modernizing Basic, a casual online-only format where each deck must contain only basic lands and the Modernizing Simic Visionary Vanguard. Since all the creatures in the format are tokens, any phasing creature players were unlucky to hit before this change, well, they would all be duds because they would phase out and cease to exist. The other major impact this change had was on Legacy. With Batterskull being a game-deciding card for Stoneblade decks, some players took to running Sapphire Charm as an answer. Recall that if a creature phases out, all the ores and equipment attached to it phase out indirectly. If you phased out the Germ token while Batterskull was equipped to it, the token would cease to exist, meaning the Batterskull would have no way to phase back in. Short of restarting the game with Karn, it was gone forever. Changing the rules so that tokens could phase in and out like normal creatures made it so this trick didn't work anymore. Fortunately, while Sapphire Charm's stock went right back to zero, phasing's did not. Teferi's Protection proved a game-changingly powerful card in Commander, which revived interest in this long-dead mechanic. With Teferi in Core Set 2021, Out of Time in MH2, and Blink Dog, Divine Smite, and others in AFR, having permanents phase out eventually became a deciduous mechanic that regularly shows up in standard sets. And that takes us all the way to the present day. Despite the influx of new phase-out cards since 2017, the mechanic has remained functionally unchanged for close to a decade now. Stories like this are honestly one of my favorite things about Magic. The rules team changed how phasing worked a few times on the way to a clean, efficient solution that fits into a recurring design need. I hope you had fun going through phasing's remarkable redemption arc with me. That's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.